This video is brought to you by Blessed Be God Boutique, maker of Catholic fashionable apparel, handmade accessories, and more.
Perhaps one of the strangest things we've seen going on in the life of the Church is that Francis has yet another book about him coming out soon. As we learn, there is on average one biography of him written and released a year. This time there's a biography basically by him coming out, which is to be differentiated from another biography of his that has already come out that I have sitting on my bedside table as I try to chore through the thing. These biographies, though, give some things away. And we can understand Francis's attitude about things and where he's going to go with things. And unwittingly, it seems, some in the traditional Catholic world are setting things up, almost preparing things, suggesting things to him that would actually help him with one of his goals, which is the functional elimination of the traditional form of the sacraments and the Mass, at least in the Western Church. These two issues go hand in hand, as I'm going to attempt to show you here, as we begin here with an article about this new papal biography, and an interesting thing Francis said about traditionalists and conservatives in the Church. So we go to Catholic News Agency, who provide some important context in their article on this. You see, in the article about the book, the author goes over some important events that happen in the book, things that you would expect in a biography. We learn about Francis's parents and their thoughts on the events of World War II, and we'll say certain high-profile leaders in World War II, ones you're not allowed to name explicitly on this platform, and how those figures and the events of the war framed Francis's thinking on world events, the events of that fateful day in the fall of 2001 that changed the course of history afterwards, and other important historical events. These, again, are the kinds of things you expect from a biography of a high-profile world leader. Then it gets interesting. Here's what I mean by that. Quote, "Next comes the resignation of Benedict XVI and his own election to the See of Peter. Thereafter, a slight change of tack emerges, and the closing chapters are perhaps the most interesting of all." Quoting the book, "Pope Benedict took the opportunity to affirm his promise of unconditional reverence for and obedience to the new pope. His position as Pope Emeritus has been exploited for ideological and political ends by unscrupulous people, who may have prioritized their own interests and guarded their turf while underestimating the risk of a dramatic split within the Church. Later, Pope Francis criticizes those who, quote, create bad feeling within the Church and disorientation among the faithful, and turns to his regular bête noire of clericalism, which he believes creates distance between priests and people. These attitudes have driven the faithful away. It is therefore important to preserve and promote the faith by placing ourselves close to the people, leaving our embroidery, frills, and lace cuffs in the closet and concentrating instead on the Christian message of compassion and closeness." The author says, "I've never quite understood how closeness to the people and dignified liturgical vestures are mutually exclusive, but then only one of us is God's vice-regent on earth, and it certainly isn't me." End quote. In that article in that quote was a backhanded sort of dig at Cardinal Robert Sarah, who was writing with Benedict XVI and a few others a book about issues happening in the Church, and Benedict's name appeared on the early versions of the book's cover, and I believe still does in the United States. You'll have to check on that, though. That book caused a stir of controversy, with even Ratzinger himself distancing himself a little bit from it afterwards, through Archbishop Gonswein, though, so we always take that with a grain of salt. But that's who he's talking about here. And people like Cardinal Sarah, men like Cardinal Burke, Bishop Schneider, Vigano. You name the bishop who is one that we frequently have letters from on this channel, that's who he's talking about. These are figures who he say undermines the unity of the Church. They all happen to be dedicated to some degree or another to tradition. That's not a coincidence. This attitude of his lends credence to the idea that we're in for a sequestration of traditional groups in the Church, the idea being that Rome will push us out to the margins of the Church's society as much as possible. We saw the first stages of this with the implementation of Traditionis Custodes, where the number of traditional Latin Mass offerings in any diocese was limited, and many bishops choosing to put their TLM offerings in remote locations in their dioceses. But then we got a sign of the next stage, and weirdly it comes as a suggestion from some traditional Catholics themselves. And if Francis was smart about trying to reduce the influence of those he described in his biography as trying to divide the church and harm unity in the church, he would take this in a heartbeat with some restrictions. So from Orate Caeli, we get this headline: An Ordinariate for Traditional Catholics? An interview with Father de Bliniers. The priest they're interviewing is a theologian. Now, if you don't know what an ordinariate is, you've heard of the Anglican ordinariate almost certainly. An ordinariate would mean that every approved traditional priestly fraternity, and maybe even traditional religious communities, a little fuzzy on this, would have a single or team of bishops who oversees them, like the Anglican ordinariate does. They'd be treated essentially as a diocese. The FSSP, when their founding priest broke with Rome, were actually promised a bishop, but Rome has never delivered on that promise in the past 34 years since the break happened, and the FSSP in the years since have kind of waffled on whether they were promised that or not. But that promise goes back to something Archbishop Lefebvre of the SSPX was promised. He was offered a bishop to run the SSPX, one picked by Rome. He didn't trust them, so he didn't take the offer. The FSSP priests who broke away when Archbishop Lefebvre consecrated the bishops without Rome's permission accepted the offer and never got their bishop. Hardline traditionalists kind of have a "I told you so" attitude about the whole thing, which is completely understandable from where I'm sitting. But this idea has been floated before, and with rumors again swirling about the possibility of a Rome-approved consecration of bishops happening soon with the SSPX, this idea could well support Francis's goal of driving traditional Catholics towards the margins of church life, which might be perfectly fine with most traditional Catholics, quite frankly, though it would marginalize our influence in day-to-day affairs at our parishes, which is kind of the point. But here's the idea from the theologian himself. Quote, considering the new situation created by the motu proprio Traditionis Custodes and the documents of the Dicastery for Divine Worship in 2021, Father Louis-Marie de Blinières proposes the establishment of a traditional ordinariate, meaning in canonical terms an ecclesiastical circumscription dedicated to the ancient Latin rite. This type of structure, like military ordinariates, ex-Anglican ordinariates, or Eastern Catholic eparchies, consists of a group of faithful served by a clergy, headed by a prelate appointed by the Holy See. The traditional ordinariate would offer a stable structure for Catholic faithful wishing to receive the sacraments according to traditional forms. The former prior of the Fraternity of St. Vincent Ferrer is interviewed on the subject in the FSSP magazine Tu es Petrus. Here's the question he was asked. Why are you proposing the creation of an ecclesiastical circumscription for the ancient Latin rite? To which he replies, because a completely new situation has been created by the publication of the motu proprio Traditionis Custodes in July 16, 2021, and by that of the documents of the Dicastery for Divine Worship in December 2021. These texts led to a blockbuster situation for those Catholic faithful to hierarchical communion and also attached to the earlier forms of the Latin tradition. Pope Francis has ended the period of relative calm that followed the motu proprio Summorum Pontificum. This aimed to give the extraordinary form its rightful place in the very structures of dioceses. Rather than mourning what might have been, we must now offer something stable to Catholics faithful to the Holy See and to traditional pedagogies of the faith. This group, instead of having to constantly negotiate its status with prelates, bishops, or parish priests, who often find it hard to understand or who fear for the peace of their dioceses by showing favoritism toward it, should, in our opinion, be represented in the hierarchy itself. End quote. Some of that sounds good. Worth reminding ourselves that that kind of an organization would exist or not exist within a diocese at the pleasure of the local ordinary, the bishop, who is the supreme authority in the church in a geographic region. Any other group who wants to go there has to have their permission, with the exception of the SSPX, who don't bother with such things. Now, the theologian goes on to define the terms of what he's talking about, and we'll get to that in a second. The authority to do what he's suggesting, the creation of a traditionalist ordinariate, lies completely with Francis, who would delegate the authority to the dicastery of bishops and the clergy. The idea is fairly radical in nature. It would essentially complete the elimination of the Ecclesia Dei Institute by putting groups like the FSSP and the Institute of Christ the King Sovereign Priest and many others like them into the hands of the dicastery of the bishops, placing a single or team of bishops to oversee them in one neat basket, which would then allow a future Francis II to eliminate rather easily all of the groups when the time comes. That may sound paranoid to some of you, but the letter accompanying Traditionis Custodes explicitly says that the laity attached to the TLM are to be taught about how great Vatican II was, how great the new Mass is, how great the new forms of the sacraments are, and how we are all to be brought back to your local diocesan parish eventually. That is the stated goal of Traditionis Custodes. It's all in the letter Francis wrote to the bishops that went with Traditionis Custodes. Bear that in mind when hearing about the nuts and bolts of this proposed reform. Quote, the theologian is asked, what is this ecclesiastical circumscription? And he responds, ecclesiastical circumscription is a generic term used by canonists to cover very different realities. Ecclesiastical circumscriptions are hierarchically structured communities of the faithful that are either dioceses, particular churches, or entities created for special reasons and legally assimilated to dioceses. These include military ordinariates and personal apostolic administrations. They could serve as models for the case we are presenting. Vatican II encouraged the development of these formulas, which have been around for a long time. The adaptability of ecclesiastical organization to the pastoral realities of the faithful is one of the essential aspects of the last ecumenical assembly, meaning Vatican II. End quote. And that proposal is actually almost terrifying in this context of Traditionis Custodes. Because Traditionis Custodes tells us that we're all to come back to the ordinary form. What used to be called the ordinary form, before Francis abolished that term and declared the new Mass to be the sole and unique expression of the Roman rite of Mass, which is by itself just ahistorical, given that the traditional Latin Mass was never the sole and unique expression of the Latin rite of liturgy until 1970. There are other forms of Latin liturgy in the West. But when you understand what Francis is doing, what the stated goal of Traditionis Custodes is, putting everybody into one neat basket like that could solve all of Francis's problems. If he were interested. He has signaled that he's not that interested in the liturgy anymore, the liturgical questions. But if Francis II might be, all this gets more and more interesting as people begin asking basic questions like, when is Francis going to correct Cardinal Hollerich? Because Cardinal Hollerich is out there completely contradicting Francis on the question of women's ordination. And in the context of Francis keeping certain high-profile cardinals around him now at all times. Conclave is coming. There will be a new pope sometime in the not terribly distant future. How long is only known to God. But what do you think of this? Do you see how Francis outlines his basic concerns with rigid clericalists? Do you see what he's doing? And do you think that the suggestion from the theologian is a mixed bag at best? Or do you think it's a really great idea? Let me know in the comments, please. And the sources for that will be posted at my show notes, returntotradition.org, minutes after this thing goes live. Let me know what you think in the comments, please, and hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.